Hello, g'day everyone. My name's Andrew Whitehouse and I'm very lucky enough to be part of the Autism CRC, and I am your host for today's webinar, which is the first in our autism webinar series for autism, International Autism Month for 2021. So we are holding 6 webinars over the course of April, which is to help improve our understanding about autism and to share some of the Autism CRC's latest research and outcomes across the 3 programs. It's the early years, school years and adulthood. So this is the first webinar that we'll be talking about today. There's 5 further ones. On Monday, we're having a webinar that's looking at writing and transitions for children and young people. On Tuesday, there'll be 2 webinars, very busy. One on health assessment and diagnosis, and that includes information about the nationwide rollout and implementation of the National Guideline for Diagnosis. And one to discuss the landmark report we released late last year, which summarised the available evidence for interventions for kids on the autism spectrum. Next Thursday, we're talking about autism in the workplace. I'm looking forward to that one. And then next Friday, we have a panel discussion featuring 3 autistic scholars. And it's definitely not too late to register for them. So if you'd like to do that, please just go to the Autism CRC website. This morning, super looking forward to as well. It's a launch of the latest reports from the Australian Autism Research Council, or the AARC, a community-led group which is auspiced under Autism CRC and led very well by Wenn and Liz, who will be our presenters today. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and how lucky we are to and I recognise the continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and I do pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, both on the lands that I am and I'm sure as well. So for today's webinar, I would like to let you know that you have the opportunity to submit text questions by typing your questions in the Q&A down below. And it has 2 speech bubbles as an icon. If you'd like to send a question in, please include the name of the presenter who you'd like to answer your question. Please submit the questions to the speakers via the Q&A panel rather than the chat panel. I know that's a bit confusing, but the Q&A panel is really the one to use, and we'll make sure we get to them. All right, you can send your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect them and we'll have a Q&A at the end. It's going to be really interesting. So on to today's topic, and I'll make sure I shut up soon. The Australian Autism Research Council, or AARC, which I'm sure you'll refer to as that, was established in 2018 to review and define national priorities for autism research in Australia and identify areas of research need for the autistic and autism communities. Today, we're very lucky to hear from Wenn and Liz, launching 2 reports which include 50 research questions that were developed through focus groups that were held by the AARC last year. We have 3 speakers joining us to launch the AARC reports, including the 2 co-chairs of the AARC. So the first of the AARC co-chairs I'd like to introduce is Dr. Wenn Lawson, who's an Autism CRC project leader, autistic advocate, well-respected speaker and author, and etc. I'm sure everyone knows Wenn. I'm sure also everyone knows Liz. Professor Liz Pellicano was the co-chair of the AARC. She's an Autism CRC project leader, Professor of Education at Macquarie University, Australian Research Council Future Fellow, and all-round knowledgeable guru in this area. Liz and Wenn are also both part of the project team for the Sylvia Rogers Academy Research Program, and how wonderful it is to have that named after Sylvia. We're also joined by Tori Haar, who works in the Autism CRC Research Office. Hi, Tori, where part of her role is coordinating and providing support to the AARC. So without further delay, I will be quiet now, and I'd like to welcome Tori to start us off for today's presentation. I'll pop back on after and we'll coordinate the Q&A, and we'll finish at the top of the hour. Thanks, Tori, take it away.
Thanks, Andrew. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. I will just find the right button to start presenting the slides. All right, there we go. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands that we're working and doing things on today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that we celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture, connections to land and waters of Australia. As Andrew briefly mentioned, today we're actually launching 2 reports. First off, we have the research report on focus groups to identify research questions for community-informed priority areas, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but that is the research report that's been developed by and written by AARC Research, which is the vendor that the AARC engaged to run the focus groups for this round of community consultation. And we're also releasing an additional report, which is the 2020 to 2021 research priority update from the AARC, which is a report that's been written by members of the AARC and is intended to be read alongside the research report from AARC. Both of the reports go through a bit of the process and what we did, but the AARC report goes into more detail, and that's the report that has the 50 research questions that were developed in it. The commentary by the AARC talks a bit more about next steps, limitations and opportunities as well. And I'd like to make sure to thank and acknowledge the 55 members of the community who were our community experts for these focus groups, and also to the team from AARC who ran these focus groups for us. So to give a quick bit of background, the AARC was established in April of 2018 to review and define community-informed priorities for autism research, and it's a pretty diverse bunch of people from both the autistic and broader autism communities. The terms of reference are designed to bring different stakeholders together. We have some minimums to help us do that, in that there's got to be at least 3 autistic people and at least 1 representative from a number of other communities, including a researcher, a service provider, and a parent. And the objective of the AARC is to provide a regular and ongoing mechanism to consult on the state of autism research in Australia, to identify priorities, report on those priorities, and then inform funding strategies for autism research in Australia. This is the current membership of the AARC, as has already been said. The very lovely and very accomplished Wenn and Liz are our co-chairs, but we also have a broader range of experiences, autistic people, parents, professionals, and lots of people who cover more than one group. I'd also like to acknowledge Catherine Anir, Dr. Samara Toby, and Dr. Renata Morello, who were members of the AARC for either some or all of this focus group process leading up to this report, and particularly to Catherine and Samara, who are founding members of the AARC. These are the 2019 research priorities that the first iteration of the AARC developed, which had a slightly different membership, including today's host, Andrew Whitehouse. So to give a bit of background, first off, the AARC looked at existing priority settings, exercises, and Australia's national and international commitments like the UN Convention of the Rights with People with Disabilities, and used that information to come up with some draft priorities that it then consulted the community about. That consultation largely consisted on a survey which had both a standard and easy read version, and over 1,000 people completed, but we also had 21 written submissions as well. After considering and discussing those survey results, the AARC put together a final list of the 10 research priorities you see on the screen, being built environment, choice in living and housing, communication, education, employment, family and carer support, gender diversity and inclusion, health and disability service delivery, health and wellbeing, and justice. And between the draft and the final priorities, An additional 3 priorities were added, and the wording of a few of the others was refined. So it's all well and good to have these priorities, but what do we do this for? The AARC considers that community consultation and engagement around these research priorities is an ongoing and an iterative process that we want the community to keep being involved in. We want to provide the research community and, importantly, funding bodies with a better understanding of what the Australian autistic and broader autism communities are interested in around autism research. And so in addition to the priorities themselves, a few of the potential benefits that we feel like can arise from this sort of work are helping to ensure that the research is relevant to the community and wherever possible results in something that people can actually use in their everyday lives, knowing what areas of research the community might be interested and motivated to help contribute to through co-production, consultation, etc., and building a better understanding of the level of community awareness about what research is doing and has already done, because it's all well and good to do the research, but if people don't know it exists and don't have access to the results, then it makes a nice journal publication, but what else is there? And Liz will touch on this later on in the presentation. But now I'd like to hand over to Wenn, who's going to take us through what the AARC has been doing for the last 15 months.
Thanks, Tori. Next steps, because we've uncovered so many things, it was really hard to work out what we would be, how we would then put all that into some sort of practice through focus groups. And the decision was that we would have these 5 priorities out of 7, and it wasn't easy to whittle that down. But future consultation targeted working groups to identify more detailed research questions under those identified priorities. Since the survey only covered whether or not which areas were ones we would be looking at, they didn't actually explore how to take that further. So that needed to happen, and that's why the focus groups came about. We needed to broaden that out. The recommendation became the key focus of that second iteration of the AARC, which started in January 2020. In the planning stages, the terminology change from focus groups, working groups to focus groups to best reflect what, the structure of how that would happen, because they were going to use kind of message boards where people could come in and online. Everything changed because of COVID anyway, but this was the way that it was thought was the best way forward. So we went to focus on 5 of those priorities rather than the full 10. And that meant that in the future, of course, that can broaden out as the AARC looks at that in a wider way. But the highest rated priorities, except for only focusing on the more, we focused on the highest rated priorities, and the 2 health priorities, we pushed those together to 1. So then there had to be a tender process, and we were all asked to think about bodies we could refer to who would take this further, but ARMA won that tender, and they were the ones that took this further. Next slide, please. So ARMA took this further. They were the agency that took this on to work on behalf of the CRC and the AARC. There were some things that were set out, like people to join the focus groups had to be aged 18 or over and living in Australia. We needed 12 members per group, 3 autistic individuals, 2 parents or family members of autistic individuals, 2 relevant professionals. No one was selected for more than 1 group, but it's interesting that later when we see the numbers and how many were autistic and how many were not, that people in parents groups, for example, were autistic as well. So it was certainly well spread out. So as ARMA were the successful vendor, the AARC spent quite a bit of time thinking about who would be beneficial to have in those focus groups, and we contributed in discussions with Orma absolutely about that. And it was certainly to ensure a diverse range of stakeholders and relevant experiences in similar fashion to those of the ARC itself. And this included, but certainly was not limited to, autistic people, family members, and relevant professionals. Relevant professionals varied for each group. For instance, a primary school teacher would have been considered a relevant professional for the education group, but not for justice or employment. Next slide, please. The priority perspective, so some examples of how that would work. All groups, autistic individuals who communicate non-traditionally, remote, regional, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We've really wanted to locate that group of people as well, and this was very difficult to do. As an example, in education perspectives relevant to different stages of the education journey. So early childhood, primary, secondary, and tertiary. We wanted people that had some experience in all of those. Employment, employers who currently employ at least one autistic staff member and professional working to assist autistic people to obtain and or maintain employment. So quite specifically looking for people that would fit into those groups, trying to develop and encourage inclusion of voices, hence those that were minimally verbal or didn't use language as a communication. People were able to share if they represented some of the identified priority perspectives for the groups they were interested in, as well as their skills and experiences as part of that expression of interest process. Next slide, please. So recruitment and responses, and we made flyers, and these were put up on the various CRC and other Facebook pages and so on. Emails were sent out, and people that had originally joined wanted or had shown interest to joining the ARC but hadn't been successful. They were initially contacted because they'd shown an interest in wanting to share in what the ARC was doing. So they were contacted to see if they wanted to join groups. There were people that were contacted through ARC members and word of mouth and so on. 70 expressions of interest were received. Over 80%, it was massive, expressed interest in more than one group. But of course, we could only have them involved in one group. So this was not necessarily an easy thing to do. Community members could express interest in up to 3 groups, and we received 70 expressions of interest, most people expressing interest in multiple groups. And we had to whittle that down. So next slide, please. And I'm trying to keep up with my own slides on my laptop so I can try and stay relevant into which slide is the right one to be talking to. So group rankings by number of preferences, and you can see there that we had interest in all of the groups, but there was some variance in what proportion of individuals who submitted an expression of interest preference different groups, including differences between autistic and non-autistic and parents and carers versus non-autistic parents and carers. Education and health and well-being were the most commonly preferenced overall, being preferenced by 76 respectively and 64% of applicants. So again, this was pretty high. The percentages of autistic and non-autistic applicants preferencing education were similar, but almost half of non-autistic applicants selected education as their first preference compared to over a quarter of autistic applicants. And that in itself tells us something. Next slide, please. Group composition, 10 to 12 members per group. That were 55 in total, 71% families, family members, autistic people, 61% relevant professionals. But there was a good mix of perspectives across the 5 groups. A large number of autistic participants were also parents, as I said earlier. So while the family members percentage is higher on this side on this slide, only 29% of the cohort was non-autistic parents, carers, or family members. We also had a few people who were selected but chose not to participate, and 3 direct invitations were issued where an important form of professional experience wasn't represented in the expressions of interest. So we sent out some invitations to make sure that was covered too. Next slide, please. In this process, there was a high-level literature scan, and I need to emphasize scan. We really had to make sure that we were scanning broadly the literature, online discussion groups, midpoint surveys, individual groups, prioritization survey from all members, and then of course with ARMA there was the analysis. So how the focus group works is that following a very high level literature scan to help guide the questions asked, the participants were part of a 10-day online discussion board with their groups, so they each had their own, to discuss and refine potential topics and research questions for their area. The discussion groups were facilitated by 2 researchers, including the autistic consultant that ARMA engaged for this project. Halfway through the discussion board, their group completed a prioritization survey. And at the end of all the groups, the members were invited to complete another prioritization survey, which included the top questions for each of the 5 groups. This final produced a list of the most highly rated questions or topics, really interesting stuff, for both the community experts engaged for each specific topic and the list of the 10 most highly rated questions or topic in that area according to that focus group members. So each of those 5 groups came out with their own. These questions are relatively complex, reflect language and concepts raised and discussed by groups, and encompass a range of different areas and perspectives, and they really were varied. For example, one of the questions for employment in the employment group is what factors create a safe work environment and culture for autistic employees, with some further detail about how that might happen. So these were seen as areas broken down specifically for research to be continuing on to be taken on in the future. Next slide, please. Communication. How can the acceptance and use of diverse forms of communication, including non-verbal or alternative communicators in education settings, be improved to support all autistic students to participate in the educational and social curriculum? As you know, we believe it should be nothing about me without me. Identifying effective ways to reframe community attitudes, massive task, towards diverse forms of autistic communication, using a strength-based neurodiversity approach instead of the current deficit-based medical model. I just wanted to say that I kind of come to notice that in some of the posts and things I've been reading, there's been this misbelief that neurodiversity is the autistic group or the autistic and cousins group compared to the typical group who are not neurodiverse. And this is a total myth. Of course, neurodiversity is to the brain and the nervous system as biodiversity is to plants and animals on Earth. So neurodiversity means all. We are all part of what is neurodiverse. And when we talk about neurodiversity, that encompasses all of us. And sometimes I think people have a slight worry or concern about using the word autistic. So I've had an email where someone said, our neurodiverse students. Well, that doesn't mean a lot to me. If they mean they're autistic students, it's best to say that. Stigma will continue unless we begin to make these sorts of changes. We should not be feared or frightened to use the term autistic and autism. We're all part of neurodiversity. Okay, next slide, please. Forgive that slight detour. After an autism diagnosis at any age, autism is not just for children, and children do not grow out of being autistic. How can autistic people be supported to identify individual communication strengths, options, and preferences? How can families and professionals play a positive role in this to ensure full accessibility in education, employment and community. So these are research questions that are being a bit more refined. What are the most effective ways to improve the understanding that communication between diverse autistic communicators and non-autistic people is a shared responsibility? Absolutely emphasis on the shared responsibility. Next slide, please. And in education, how can teaching, learning and assessment approaches be tailored to better meet the individual needs of autistic students in the classroom? We talk a lot about accommodations that can be made, and in schools that's been written down, but actually seeing that implemented is not happening. Accommodations are not happening in many of our schools, and this needs to change. What are the most effective training and professional development opportunities or approaches for educators in preparing them to support and teach autistic students? Where are there systemic opportunities for the development and implementation of educator training to be produced in partnership with autistic people? Nothing about me without me, please. And the next one, also in education, investigate the impact of environmental factors in the classroom and playground, sensory layout, aesthetics, schedules. Why is it such a big deal? You might have a school uniform at school, but why is it such a big deal that, you know, caps are not meant to be worn in class, or sunglasses for our students who might need them? We wouldn't make such a comment if somebody needed a wheelchair or a walking cane. And yet so often for our autistic students, for them to be able to focus, they might need to hold a soft toy or have something within their that they're wearing to enable them to focus. Otherwise they're not as grounded. What are autistic students' preferences for flexible and or predictable learning environments? What is the access to these, and how effective are they in supporting learning and well-being outcomes? Next slide, please. Employment, as you know, we've got the webinar coming up on employment later in the week, and next week, and I'm excited about that. What are the flexibility and predictability needs? Flexibility and predictability needs and preferences of autistic people in the workplace, and how these can best be supported. Gee, if only people took this on. This includes working hours, environment, workplace practices and processes, setting spoken and unspoken social expectations, diverse communication preferences. It's okay not to be in the staff room to have your lunch or coffee. It's okay to sit alone for a meal when you've been so immersed in work time. It's okay not to be part of a group. All of these sorts of things. Nothing about me without me. We should be talking about this. What barriers do employers experience in employing autistic people? So this works both ways. And how can these be overcome? Next slide, please. How can employment services most effectively, did I say this already? I can't remember. Support their autistic clients to ensure and keep their employment that is fulfilling, meaningful and appropriately paid. Golly, appropriately paid. I remember the first time I did a talk as an autistic person, I got a bunch of flowers, everybody else got paid. And I remember thinking what I'm presenting about autism as part of my story, you can't get paid for that because that's my life. How wrong I was and how thinking has changed. What factors create a safe work environment and culture for autistic employees? What factors create a safe work environment and culture for autistic employees? How can employers support and promote employees through inclusive culture, policies, practices, and individual preferences? There's such huge words, vitally important. Next slide, please. It's health and well-being. What is the prevalence of chronic mental and physical health conditions among autistic people, considering demographic factors, e.g. age, ethnicity, culture, identity, LGBTQIA+, examining contributing factors to these conditions. And again, these are huge, huge things, and they will be broken down even further. But this is what came out of those focus groups and what came out of the boards that people were writing up on. How do autistic people respond to medical tests, treatments, I hate that word, and medications? Identify what can be done to accommodate these. One of the reasons I like the ICF codes, looking at functioning, is because it takes on that psychosocial model. Rather than arguing about medical model and social model, it combines the two. And I think we'll be hearing more about that in the future. Next question, next slide, please. Health and Wellbeing continues. How appropriate, effective and accessible is the current diagnosis and assessment process for autistic individuals across the lifespan? We know waiting lists are too long. We know that for adults, it's really difficult to get an assessment. And we know that financially, trying to cover costs for assessments is massive. How does pretending to be non-autistic or hiding autistic traits impact on health and well-being outcomes? And we know again that that is huge, the impact that it's having on autistic people, camouflaging, masking, trying to keep themselves safe by not doing and saying things that upset others. That trying to live inside those constraints is massive, and it's overwhelming, and for some people it's too much and they switch off. Things like suicidality are massive, are really huge in our population. This next slide, justice. Does police awareness of autism and interpretation of autistic behaviour and communication impact on autistic people's experience of and outcomes in the justice system? Absolutely. What awareness or training initiatives designed with autistic people could affect effective change? There is some teaching and training going on in particular police areas of policing in certain states and certain areas, but it's still a very difficult thing. There's a terrific on YouTube first responders video that's been put together by some autistic people and friends from New South Wales, but you know, that's just one video, and we need to have so much more emphasis in law and enforcement with our police and with our justice system. Our prisons and places have too many autistic people in them who have been not understood. And this is my last slide for me. That just again on justice, what frameworks or support initiatives designed with autistic people could effectively prevent reoffending and align with individual life and well-being goals? As autistic people, we often don't get concepts. I remember as a 10-year-old, it was Mother's Day, and there were all these flowers in flower pots outside on a concrete sort of area in front of a shop. They looked really pretty. And I knew my mum loved violets, and so I took out some bunches out of the buckets, was walking off with them, and someone called out and said, "You can't have those." And I was holding them, so I said, "Yes, I can." And they said, "You can't." And I said, "Yes, I can." And so this person was getting really in my space, and as they're walking closer to me, I was backing off. They said, "You haven't paid for them." And I said, "Why would I do that?" You know, they're here, they're in these buckets, they're for free. I had failed to take in that big picture of understanding, so common as autistic people. We get ourselves into all sorts of problems, and which ends up in the justice system. Once you're in there, it's very difficult to get out. Examine the number and proportion of autistic people in the criminal justice system, including rate of offending, type of offences, charges, sentencing, incarceration, parole and reoffending. Identify demographics and diversity factors. So that for me is my last slide, and of course Liz is going to speak next, so I will say thank you.
Thank you so much, Wenn, and also to Tori. And hello everyone. I mean, just to begin, I want to begin by saying that I'm currently on Gomaragal land, and I recognise that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. Wenn has given you a fantastic flavour of some of the research questions that were prioritised and identified by the experts within each of the 5 areas. But what was particularly informative about this community consultation was the broad overarching themes that emerged across experts' discussions, and the key shifts in the way that autism seems to be being understood and responded to within research and society more broadly. So Orima has very helpfully highlighted these themes in their report, which you'll be able to read. But key amongst these themes were efforts to shift away from the traditional medical model in autism research, which I know Wenn has already touched on, But for those of you who don't know, the medical model really dominates autism research and is based on the belief that the difficulties associated with being autistic can be explained primarily on the basis of disordered biological processes, that is, processes that reside wholly within an individual. So there's no room within the traditional medical model for the social dimensions of being autistic. There is, however, increasing recognition within autism research that such a model is insufficient and that we need to consider, more broader social influences and the need for societies and other people's role in creating disability for autistic people. And the ORMA process, I think, indicated how deeply dissatisfied the experts, so autistic people and their allies, were with the continued use of the medical model within autism research. Next slide, please, Tori. So the discussions reported from the focus groups demonstrated that, there is a gap that still exists between what is researched and what gets researched. What gets researched and what autistic people and autism and autistic communities feel is most important to them. And we know that from other priority setting exercises that have been conducted over the past 10 years, that research has repeatedly shown that the vast majority of the research that gets done focuses on basic science, so the underlying biology and causes of autism, rather than on research that is prioritised by autistic people, family members and those who support them, which should focus instead on people's more immediate practical concerns. And as Tori indicated at the start of this webinar, priority setting exercises are one way of narrowing this gap, narrowing the gap between what currently gets researched and what autistic people and their allies want to be researched. Priority setting exercises bring together community members to shape the research agenda by identifying and prioritising the top areas in a research field, just as Wenn has described. And they also ensure that researchers and research funders are aware of the issues that matter most to the people being researched. And so many of the questions that Wenn has gone through that have been developed through the focus groups aren't yet being thoroughly examined in academic practice, but I think would hopefully will resonate with many autistic people and their families and autistic and autism communities. In each of the 5 priority areas, questions were identified that directly related both to improving understandings of the subjective experience of being autistic, and also to pursuing kind of the identification of real or tangible changes to a social environment that is currently poorly designed to serve autistic people's needs. So the AARC's 2020-21 Research Priority Update report is intended to be read alongside the ORMA report. So there are 2 reports, the ORMA report and then the AARC's kind of commentary on that report. Now that the questions are identified, we've got those 50 questions, it's crucial that we develop a program to help researchers know what to do with these questions so that the whole process can best fulfill its potential. And I think this point brings us directly to the issue of how research is conducted, as well as what the questions are. So all stages of the AARC's community consultation have really reinforced our sense that autistic people and their allies want to be involved in decisions around research. As Wenn said multiple times, nothing about us without us. And there's no reason, just because we've done this community, or that the experts have done this community consultation, there's no reason to assume that this enthusiasm to be involved just ends with these research questions. Instead, it's likely that we want to see, the enthusiasm to be involved in the research process itself, in the design, the conduct, and the dissemination of the resulting research. Involving autistic people and their allies in this way should ensure that research is more attentive to people's needs and preferences and is more consistent with their values. And I think Orima's research highlighted that many experts in the community consultation expressed a desire for researchers to be more transparent, to be more open with their study participants, and to be more thoroughly supportive during the research process, accommodating people's preferences and needs. And I think doing so really serves to build trust between researchers and the broader community. I think a trust that might have been bit lacking of late. So what's next? So the AARC has recommended that, that community consultation and engagement around the autism research priorities should be an ongoing and iterative process. It doesn't stop here. Just because we got these questions doesn't stop. So members of the AARC, we're going to spend the next 6 months, the rest of the year basically, discussing what the next steps should look like. So we're going to take the time to reflect on what has been achieved and what we need to do next. And this reflection, you know, could include several areas, but might include things like looking at how we can work better with funders and researchers to make them aware of the priorities and the topics that the experts have identified and are interested in. We might also look at overseas examples, so other priority setting exercises around the world to compare, you know, the results from our community consultation with theirs. I don't think we're going to have any more focus groups or surveys held in 2021, but what we will do is write a report which will be released at the end of the year in November, which will essentially report on our reflections and particularly kind of thinking about what comes next. Importantly to note, there are still, you know, we focused on 5 priority areas for this initial community consultation, but there are of course still 5 priorities from the 2019 community consultation which haven't been explored in depth with community experts. So that's another thing that we might look towards doing in the coming years. I think that's me. Over back to Tori.
All right, well, continuing on from talking about next steps and what we've done, thanks Liz and Wenn. Some people might have noticed that our normal expression of interest didn't happen at the end of 2020. This was due to delays in having the focus groups, partly due to COVID, and we felt like it was really important for the AARC that had started on the focus groups to see that process through to completion and the release of the reports that we're releasing today. So instead, we're going to do a bigger recruitment process at the end of this year. We don't have an exact date for this yet, but we anticipate it will open sometime in August and be open for around a month. Similar to what we did last time, the EOIs will be submitted through an online form that individuals will complete rather than any organisation that might want to nominate them or support their application. And it's fairly straightforward. It mainly asks people for their contact details, about what their connection is to the autistic and broader autism communities and why they'd like to join the AARC. And we'll advertise this through social media and the Autism CRC's e-news. But if you're interested, you can find more about what being on the AARC involves by visiting our website at autismcrc.com.au/AARC, which is AARC. And I'm sure one of the background tech people will put that link in the chat. And you can, there's also a space there for you to sign up to be kept informed about the next EOI process. Once we've got the EOIs, it will take a little while for the AARC to go through them. So we anticipate that the office will be made in November, a little bit before the report is released, and then will be announced publicly alongside the launch of the brief update that Liz mentioned. And then those new members will commence in January of 2022. And finally, I get to make an exciting little additional surprise announcement, which is that another important difference with this year's recruitment is that for the first time, people from New Zealand will be eligible to apply to join the AARC. So from January of next year, the AARC will be renamed from the Australian to the Australian Autism Research Council, and to reflect the change in focus. And this will result in a few changes to our terms of reference to update how things are referred to cover both countries. But the key differences in terms of the terms of reference are that the membership will increase slightly from 14 to 15 as the maximum membership, and a requirement will be added that there needs to be at least 2 people on the AARC from each of the 2 countries. And of those minimum 2 people, at least 1 person needs to either be autistic themselves or the parent carer of an autistic person. And that is it for us in terms of our presentation. Wenn's given you a taste of the top 4 according to the community, the focus group experts of the questions, but there's still a lot more out there and the reports, and we hope you'll get a lot out of it and that it will start shifting and filling in some of that gap in some small way.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you much, Wenn, Tori and Liz. I really got a lot out of that, and I can see from the questions others did too. We have about 8 minutes for questions, so I might just start ripping through a few of them. First one I'm just going to combine, and there's combine 2 into 1, and I can throw it to Liz, and Liz might want to throw it to someone else, but just talking about the consultation phase and the makeup of the people consulted. Can you expand on how people who do not communicate with language, I'm assuming that's verbal language, were able to contribute, and also the ethnic representation in the focus groups? So I'll throw to Liz, and you might want to throw elsewhere if you want to.
Yes, but I'm going to immediately handball that to Tori. Sorry, Tori. As Tori is much more over that those data than I am. I hope that's okay, Tori.
Yeah, could you just re-summarise that,
Andrew?
That's okay.
Yeah. How were people who don't communicate with verbal language able to contribute to the consultation?
So the online discussion groups were actually text-based, and I think across the 5 of them we had 3, maybe 4 people who either don't use verbal language at all or use it in very limited settings, like only in their home environment. And in terms of, we can't put people in focus groups that don't apply, so getting the word out there is always a little bit tricky, but we certainly try to prioritise having diverse representation. And, it's always a learning process. This is the first time the AARC has run focus groups, and I'm sure there's reflections and feedback that we'll take away from how it worked this time that we'll use to improve things next time around when we do something similar again.
Thanks, Tori. That's terrific. And while you're on a roll, I don't suppose you have anything in your head around the ethnic representation in the focus groups?
I don't have a number on that in my head. I know that for the communication focus groups, one of the groups that we particularly tried to recruit for was people who don't speak English as their first language, and I think we had at least a couple of people from that group. I don't know about the representation across the other groups other than communication.
Great, thank you very much, and certainly feel free to take some of these questions on notice. I'm just going to go through as many as I can. So just around education priority, and this is a terrific question from Matthew Osler. The focus seems to be on students in schools, but of course these sort of questions and supports can equally apply to adults in higher education, university TAFE, where there are significant barriers. This is also important in developing researchers and therefore participative research. Will this be incorporated, or will this be considered around higher education, particularly university and TAFE? Liz, I might throw it to you.
Yeah, I think that most that Matthew's right. So I mean, you didn't see the full 10 questions, but the 10 questions are mostly direct. And I think the experts within the education priority area were primarily focused on issues for autistic students in primary and secondary school years, despite kind of, I think they, tried to prompt thinking about early learning and post-secondary education or higher education. I think once you get to look at the ORMO report, you get to see the full 10. But I think that some of them will, they talk about autistic students, but I think they don't necessarily stipulate primary or secondary, and could well be extrapolated to higher education. And indeed, I think many of the, or some of the experts within the education priority area actually highlighted that many of the issues they discussed are also relevant for autistic students in tertiary education. So I think, Matthew, you're exactly right in terms of we need to make sure that we're also focusing on that group of people. But I do think that although they might not specify in the questions, I think we could. I think researchers could extrapolate and focus on higher education specifically.
Thank you.
When Tori wants to supplement that with anything.
No, terrific. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. Good question here from Rebecca Paulson. Hi, Beck. Congratulations on a great presentation. She was wondering if you have any suggestions on how basic scientists can embrace, she says basic science, but I guess basic scientists as well can actually embrace these kinds of research priorities. Solve the world in 3 minutes.
It's about getting that information out there, and the report is one of those things. We've also got papers in the pipeline that will be published, and it's just making it available to people and then knocking on doors so they take it up. So word of mouth, the written format, all of those things will eventually top down work their way. That's how we hope anyway.
Can I just add, is that okay?
Yes, please.
That I think, Beck, that so in the initial 2019 community consultation, it was derived from, for example, the UN Convention of Rights of People with Disabilities, and so basic science wasn't one of the topics that people could kind of prioritize in terms of research. And so these 5, I think that helped maybe serve that the 5 priority areas that we've got and the kinds of discussions that people had focused on more applied research. That doesn't mean, however, that researchers, can't use their, clever brains to work out how we might better understand mechanisms and specific, cognitive and neurobiological processes underlying some of those, aspects of those research questions. But I also think that it's not just about the what, it's also about the how. And I think what ORMO does that in their report, but I think what we try to emphasize in the AARC report is that the how is involving autistic people in the research process, whoever you are, whatever researcher or research background you come from. And I think that way we are going to get research that is more respectful and thorough and supportive, but as well research that will be more focused on the priority areas that we've identified or the questions we've identified, but also that will be more consistent with people's values. And I think that's really important. So there is a what there, but there's also a how. And I think basic scientists can definitely learn from the how immediately, but they might need to think a little bit more, cleverly around the what. But that's eminently doable.
Thanks, guys. And probably a couple of questions along this, and I might have to paraphrase it here. You talked about the medical model and then the social model, and I guess we could see them as lying on a spectrum. And the questions around, they might not coexist well, but is there more of a middle ground where there could be a coexistence? And is that something to pursue, a biopsychosocial model? That's my editorial on the questions, but I'd be intrigued sort of as an answer to the several questions we've had in that area.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that is so, and that's why I'm kind of excited about with the WHO's ICF, and they have a particular guideline out there for autistic and ADHD students. And I think that when that becomes, it's been out since like the 80s, but people haven't really taken it on. But I think it does do that middle ground thing of putting things together, medical and social, rather than separate. And we need to be looking at the whole person. You can't break people into bits like that. So I'm sure Liz and Tori might have more to say, but I think I'm quite excited about that prospect.
No, just to say I agree.
Great. Thanks for that, guys. Look, we might just round off with a final question, which was directed at me, but I'm going to completely pass this one on. Thanks for the question, Karen. Where and when will the 2 reports be available? I might just throw to you guys just for a quick question on that.
They should be up on the AARC website following this webinar, depending on how our tech person who's been doing it in the background has been going. There might be a delay of 10 or 15 minutes, but it'll be up this afternoon.
It says they're available now in the chat there.
Yes. Terrific. Well done, mysterious back people. Thank you so much. And can I just also just thank you all for attending today. And it's just been a terrific hour. I can't believe it's been an hour. And to Wenn, Liz and Tori as well for doing it. Thank you. If you'd like to read the reports, it says it in my notes. They are available on the Autism CRC website, and there's a link in the chat. I'd also really like just to remind you that this is the first in a series of webinars that we're doing. They're extremely popular with over 1,000 registrations across the 6 sessions. The great thing about Zoom is we don't have a room limit, so well we probably do, but we haven't reached it. But please do sign up. If you'd like to share today's webinar, we'll be placing it a recording of the session on the YouTube channel for the Autism CRC. We'll also be sharing the recording on our website through our regular social media channels, Facebook and Twitter, most likely in a couple of weeks' time. If you'd like to know more about the Autism CRC's work across the lifespan, please visit the website. And we can also sign up for our e-news and participate in some of our studies as well. You can also follow us on social media, which you can find on the website. Thank you again for participating. Thank you for the presentation, Wenn, Liz and Tori, and thank you to the mysterious backroom people who make this all happen. So have a lovely day, and I really hope to see you at another webinar.
Bye. Thank you.